I happened to stumble upon something very odd. Many years ago, I was going to the library every day doing research, and I knew every paranormal book, especially the UFO books, like the back of my hand. And I knew exactly where they were located. I knew what books were there, and I knew everything that the library had in the catalog that was pertaining to UFOs or the paranormal field, right? So I started reading this one interesting book. It was called UFO Missing Evidence. And it was a very interesting read. I really liked this book, and I checked it out several times. Well, one day I went to the library and I went to go get this book to make a reference to something in the book. Except when I went to go to find the book was missing from the shelf. And you could see where the book once was. There was an empty space, and I knew exactly where the book should have been, but it wasn't there. So I went over to the catalog, which was on a computer, and I tried to look up this book to see if it was checked out, when it would be back. Yet I could not find the book in the catalog. So I went to the librarian and, I told him, I says, I can't find this book on the catalog. I know you have this book. I'm just assuming it's checked out or maybe missing. Like, can you help me out? And the librarian says, okay, let's take a look. She looks up on the computer and says, well, this book isn't in the catalog. But she was able to check my library card and see that I had checked this book out before, which it showed the name of the book and that it was a book that was in their library, yet it was no longer in the catalog. And I said to her, if a book isn't in the catalog, what does that mean? And she said, well, it means we've never had that book. I said, what do you mean that means you never had that book? Because you did have that book. And she said, well, no one in this library is allowed to take any book out of the catalog, because the only thing we can do is, if we can't find the book, it should still be in the catalog, but we can label it as missing. And we do that for tax purposes. And we have to keep documentation that we once had this book and that it went missing, so that if we were ever audited, it would say why we wrote this book off as a missing book, as a tax expense. So we have to keep documentation of it, and we have to keep, a reference of it in the catalog. So there's no possible way anybody could have took this out of the catalog, unless it was the head librarian, but she wouldn't do that. So we tried to search for this book around the library. We couldn't find it. And we couldn't find any evidence that it ever existed there at the library, which was very odd. And I said, how many times has this happened where you had a book just completely disappear from the catalog and the shelves? And she said, well, books disappear all the time from the library, but there's reference to it because it's in the catalog. So we can know that this book was here at the library. It's no longer here. So there's a good chance that it's missing or has been stolen. And we make note of that, so we can write that off for tax purposes. So it's very odd that this book just completely vanished. Now, what's even weirder about this book is that it talked about some pretty interesting things. This book described how in the UFO field, there were people who were trying to get rid of evidence, and that they wanted to hide certain documents, certain books, and things that would prove the existence of UFOs. And they were trying to discredit several researchers and trying to take this information away and hide it and conceal it to keep researchers from knowing the truth and being able to prove this truth. And it went on to talk about, how there were several researchers, UFO researchers who had went missing and had died of strange deaths. But one story I remember very particular was about this UFO researcher who was getting ready to break a case about an apparent UFO sighting that had happened in Pennsylvania. Now, he had went off to do a conference out of town, and he was coming back on a bus to town where his brother was going to pick him up. Now, his brother was waiting for him at the bus stop, and the bus arrives. Everybody gets off the bus except for his brother. Now, he didn't get any word from his brother that he wasn't going to be on that bus. From his brother, he was told that he was going to be on the bus and that he should be waiting for it to pick him up, right? So he starts asking the other passengers, this is a picture of my brother. Have you seen my brother? And they said, yeah, we've seen him get on the bus, but we don't know where he is now. So people had seen him get on the bus, but they hadn't seen him get off the bus. And so his brother, after a couple days of not hearing from his brother, he goes to law enforcement and he tries to file a missing persons report. Yet the law enforcement agency does not want to open a missing persons report, and they tell him, your brother probably just ran away. He probably just didn't want to be found and ran away. We don't see enough sufficient evidence to open up a missing persons report. And he tried to go to various other law enforcement agencies, and they did not want to file a missing persons report, which is odd because most of the time they do. Even if there's sufficient evidence to suggest otherwise, they do open a missing persons report. So he thought that was very odd that no one would even start looking for his brother or notify people to look for his brother. So he hired several private investigators. He went to search for his brother on his own, and he came up with nothing. He couldn't find any evidence as to where his brother was or what happened to him. Now, basically, after 6 months, he figured it was time to go to his brother's house, get his affairs in order, and figure out what to do with the house and what to do with some of his stuff. So he goes to his brother's house only to find that there's 2 cars parked in the driveway. So he goes up to the door, and a couple answers the door, a husband and a wife. And he says, what are you doing in my brother's house? Why are you here at my brother's house? And they said, what do you mean your brother's house? We bought this 3 months ago. This is not your brother's house. This is our house. And he goes, no, my brother owns this house outright. He doesn't owe a mortgage. He doesn't owe any taxes on it. It's his home. And they said, well, we don't know what to tell you. We bought this from the realtor 3 months ago. It's our home now. So his brother, being confused, didn't want any issues. He left, and he tried to go find legal information to support that his brother still owned the home and to figure out what had happened. Yet he could not find any evidence to suggest that his brother owned the home. He couldn't find any legal evidence to suggest that his brother even existed. And he couldn't find nothing, any legal documents pertaining to his brother. It's as if his brother had just been wiped away and didn't exist anymore, which he thought was extremely odd, and that he couldn't understand how he could find no trace or evidence, any legal evidence that his brother had been in existence, even though he knew it was his brother. People knew that it was his brother, yet he couldn't find any legal information. So after about a year, he had finally kind of given up. He was getting nowhere. He couldn't file a missing persons report. The private investigators he had hired couldn't find any information. He couldn't find any such evidence or anybody to come forward to tell him what had happened to his brother. So he had just simply given up. And after a year, he receives this letter in the mail. And basically the letter is addressed from his brother's address, except the name is not his brother. It's a nickname that he had given to his brother when they were young, that only him and his brother knew. So he knew this letter was legitimately from his brother. So he opens up the letter and he starts reading it. And it says, I was taken and I'm being held in this camp, and this prison camp, and they're holding me against my will. And there's others here who are being held against their will, who have spoken up about UFOs and other conspiracies and are being held in this place. And the only way I was able to get this letter out to you is that I bribed a guard to send it out for me with some money. And I don't think I'll ever be able to escape or find my way out, but I want you to get the word out and tell people about what's going on. And so this brother, he went on and done several conferences and panels and spoken about this. And this was one of the interesting stories that I had found in this book. And it made me think, that there's some very strange things that are happening today that we really have to think about. That when you look at a lot of books that have pertinent information pertaining towards the paranormal, towards UFOs and UFO research, and other things are disappearing from the libraries, are disappearing from the bookstores. And you can no longer find these books. You can no longer find information. And what I find interesting on YouTube is that a lot of videos that were very interesting, that describe some interesting things about UFOs or UFO videos, have been deleted off YouTube for no reason, and there used to be tons of these same videos of UFO sighting, right? Yet you cannot find these videos on YouTube anymore. You can't find them online anymore. There were several old documentaries and stuff that had some pretty interesting information. Yet you cannot find these things anywhere. You can find no evidence of their existence. And it's like this book that had disappeared, that I could no longer find, is coming true, and that they're erasing information about UFOs and UFO research and other conspiracies. And it's just very odd that you have all these books and all this information just simply vanishing and disappearing. And it just doesn't make sense to me that there's something going on. And it's just very odd to me. But I just wanted to talk about that because I thought that was interesting, and I wonder if anybody of you have had experiences. And I know several people, before I had talked about this a long time ago, had come forward to me and said, I've noticed that you can't find certain UFO books anymore, or certain paranormal books anymore. You can't find on the shelves. You can't find at bookstores. They don't sell them. There's no existence of them anymore. They've just disappeared. And certain videos and evidence has just disappeared. And you can't find this stuff anymore, which is very interesting, needless to say.